Now I want to walk you through the simplest example that I can using the REST API directly.
When you're working with the REST API, and this applies to pretty much anything, at least anything I've done with the Azure REST API, there's basically at least a two-step process. In the first step, you're going to authenticate and you're going to get back an authentication token. And then in the second step, you're going to use that authentication token and then do whatever it is that you want to do. In this case, I'm going to use the REST API to retrieve a list of virtual machines. Basically, it's the same kind of thing that I did with the SDK demonstration a bit earlier. Now, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. There's a fair bit of code, and the code is basically first generating an HTTP request message that is going to authenticate and get a token back. And then the second is going to be generating an HTTP request message using that token as one of the headers and requesting a list of virtual machines. Okay, so fairly straightforward. Might have taken me a little while to get it right, but you won't know that because it's going to look reasonably right here. Okay, going forward, here is a very simple console application. Two steps. Line 38, I call a method authenticate REST, and it's going to authenticate and return back an object with a class that I created that just holds the token information. And then I send that token information to another method that's going to actually retrieve the VMs via the REST interface. All right, let's take a look at those two methods. And all the code's already here because you really would not want to sit here and watch me type all of this code. So here's the authenticate REST. The first thing I do is I am retrieving a number of settings, and just some of those are hard-coded in. Some of those I've got in a config file, so I don't just absolutely give away everything in terms of my account. All right, now do note the URL encoding of this client ID and secret. And the reason for that is because they're going to go on line 58 here, or no, excuse me. Hold on, they're not going line 58. Well, I'll show you where these come up, but it is important that they are URL encoded, the client ID and the secret. Okay, so the URL that I generate, and this is going to be the request URL, it just goes to login.microsoft.com/tenantid/OAuth2/token. And that's just, I'm just building that string there. All right, now this is the part where the client ID and the secret are used. They're used in the message payload, the message body, all right? And the message body is going in as form URL encoded. I'll show you that in just a moment. And so they had to be converted. Now this is actually all on one line, but I just broke it out so you can see that there are 4 components to the body of this request. There's a grant type. There's the resource I'm connecting to, which again is just a URL encoded URL to management.core.windows.net. And then my client ID and my client secret. The client ID and the client secret are associated with an account that I created in the earlier demo. I created an application account and created an identity for that, and that's what I'm actually using to communicate with the server. It's the easiest way to do it. I'm not going to go back through the creation of that. You can watch the earlier demo on that. So that gives me the payload. Because it's being sent as an HTTP body, it needs to be converted into a byte array, which is what line 67 does. Okay, so the next block there, line 69 through 75, if you've ever worked with the HTTP web request object, I'm just building up an HTTP request. Create the object based on the URL. I set the verb, which is post. You can see the content type, which for some reason I didn't set as a variable. www form URL encoded. No cache policy. And I set the host to be the host that's set up there, which is the Microsoft Online, login.microsoft online. All right, and then I set the content length to be equal to the length of the byte array. And then lines 78 through 81, I am actually adding the payload or the body to the request. And then lines 83 through 87, I am retrieving the data. So I use the getResponse method to send my request and get a handle on the response. I use the getResponse stream from that to get a stream that I can read. I then read the data, which I actually should have in a using statement, but that's okay. Little bit less than ideal there. So I get through there, and then I return an object that has been deserialized. Now, the Azure token info object, it's just this object right down here. And these are really just the Azure, excuse me, not Azure, JSON attributes that are associated. This is actually the response. I took off some of the access token. The access token is actually pretty massive. All right, but these are this is otherwise the actual JSON that I got back from that call. Okay, so I take the JSON that I get back and I just cast it into, or I deserialize it into this Azure token info object, which gets returned. I may have already said this, but it bears saying again. You will notice that there's no exception handling in my code. That is because my code is perfect. No, that is actually not why. It's because even though you absolutely always should have exception handling code in your code, I didn't put it in here because there's enough code just getting the concept. I figure you can probably figure out how to wrap this in the appropriate exception handling code. Okay, so I get the token back online. This is back up to the static void main where I call that. Then I take that token, I send it to the get VMs REST. Okay. Now this is actually a little bit easier because there's no payload, there's no message body. This is a straight get request that I'm sending. Okay. Now the get request, you can see the format of this. I get the subscription ID back because it does require the subscription ID. And then on lines 99 through 104, I broke out the actual request. And you can get this information from the REST API documentation that Microsoft provides through MSDN. It is honestly where I got it. I added a little bit of a twist so that it would filter on the virtual machines to make it consistent with what we had done in a previous demonstration. The last one here, line 103, that last query string element, API version 2015-0101, that's just something you always need to put on. That's the currently used one. If you're going to use the API directly, you always want to go and check the documentation to make sure that any standard, and there's a few different standard parameters, and depending on what you're doing that you may use, that one's pretty standard, and right now that's the version at the time of this recording. Okay, so that's the URL. That's really the GET request. And the only other thing, so lines 107 through 116 are the definition of the actual request object. Again, this is another HTTP web request. The only thing that is a little bit different is that on line 116, I am adding the authorization header, and that's really the crux of this whole thing. I add a header. It's pretty simple. It's authorization and then the word bearer followed by the token. The word bearer is actually returned as a token type, and then access token. And again, that token info is just a class I created to hold the data, the JSON data that was returned. Okay, so then the rest of this is actually pretty standard if you've ever worked with, again, a web request and web response. If you haven't, this is pretty much what you do, except for the fact that I didn't close anything, but we're going to let it run as is. I get the response, I get the stream from the response, and it's really exactly the same thing I did with the authorization or authentication. Not authorization, but authentication. Now I'm deserializing this into a different object type, Azure VM List. Same idea there though. If we go down, I can show you that. So the Azure VM List is a class that has one property. That one property is an array of type Azure VM Info, and Azure VM Info is 4 properties that get returned, and I just overrode the string so I can print it out easily. The actual response that I would get back is here. It actually gives you the subscription ID, but I thought I'd be professional and not just give out my subscription ID. Not really matters, but in any case, this is the actual JSON that I got back. Okay, so let's run this thing and see how this whole process works. At least show you that it does work. Okay, so now I'm going to hit enter. It's going to wait a little bit, and then it's a little bit anticlimactic, and I should have prepared a little better and put 2 tabs on the VM. But you can see I've got a list of VMs, different VMs, and their location. And so that's pretty much it, but it's almost a little anticlimactic on the end. There's a ton of different things that go into that. I will tell you that the documentation is a little bit tough to go through right now, and it may be improved by the time you get to it. If you are going to use the REST API directly, you might want to pull this up because it does work. You can certainly improve upon it, but you could use it as a reference. And again, also, it's a little bit tricky to use REST API directly if you're using one of the supported languages that has an SDK and has an object set. You may want to stick to using that object set.
So if we're being honest, that's why I'm going to use the SDK, the .NET SDK, or even the Python SDK, or any other language that's provided, if I possibly can, because it's just easier to work with.